The Rohirrim are one of the most valiant people in Middle-earth. Time and again, it's Riders of Rohan who have come to save the day when all seems darkest. At Helm's Deep, at Pelennor Fields, the Riders of Rohan faced seemingly impossible odds to come to the aid of Gondor, and arguably the cause of the free people of Middle-earth. The Rohirrim are brave, loyal, and steadfast. They're also colonizers. When people ask me about what The Lord of the Rings is like, I always tell them the same thing. The Lord of the Rings is a real history of a fake place. Tolkien was incredibly meticulous in the ways in which he presented his story. The details are meant to be deliberate, but that doesn't mean they don't inspire further questions. For example, during the War of the Ring, in the Third Age of Middle-earth, there's, broadly speaking, two sides to this conflict. On the one side, the free peoples of Middle-earth, and on the other, the forces of evil, led primarily by Sauron. When you zoom out on this conflict, it appears quite morally simple. I would argue it's intended to be, given some of the mythological underpinnings of the setting, like, for example, the existence of a benevolent crater deity, and so on. But when you zoom in, however, a number of peculiarities emerge. Sauron's forces, for example, are not exactly strictly united. A large part of Sauron's forces are actually, theoretically, under the command of Saruman the White, who is a wizard who betrayed the free people in his lust for power. We can imagine then that if things had turned against the free people, Sauron and Saruman would have had a showdown of some kind, probably ending with Saruman losing if I had to wager. For the free peoples, their situation is not exactly so clear-cut as well. We tend to think of the kingdoms and polities of Middle-earth as being unified, but in reality, things aren't so simple. Gondor is facing an internal political crisis because of Denethor's personal instabilities. Theoden, king of the Rohirrim, is plagued by poison, both physically and mentally, and the elves and dwarves are also withdrawn to see to their own conflicts and issues. In the books, we do get some understanding of what the elves and dwarves are doing while Gondor is preparing to fight off Mordor, but the movies did omit this. While we might lament it, movies are never going to be perfect adaptations of books. The movies do bring across the themes of Lord of the Rings, just not always the exact details. One thing in particular is, why would anyone want to side with Sauron in the first place, when he's obviously and so clearly evil? Well, we know why Saruman wants to do this. He's clearly obsessed with power and prideful enough to think that he can beat Sauron. But there are other people who have joined Sauron en masse. There are, here and there, agents of Sauron whose ambitions can be explained purely as a function of their lust for power, or at very least their willingness to cooperate with power. However, Sauron's armies are not entirely composed of shadowy wraiths, orcs, and trolls. There's people amongst them too. People just like the Gondorians and Rohirrim. Specifically, the main ones are the Variags of Khand, the Easterlings of Rhûn, the Haradrim, and the Corsairs of Umbar. Of these groups, we only really get a brief interaction with the Corsairs of Umbar in some detail. They're the ones whose ships are destroyed by the army of the dead in Return of the King. The Easterlings of Rhûn do appear in the movies to a small extent as background figures, but the Variags of Khand are completely omitted, and the Haradrim have a very brief but potent scene where the Mumakil come and fight against the Rohirrim on the plains of Pelennor Fields. But the thing is, we don't really get a lot of justification for why they might want to do this. Why would they want to side with a literal embodiment of hate and evil? Not just individuals from their culture, but their culture wholesale. The Easterlings, for example, were some of the most zealous supporters of Sauron, and even after he is defeated, they still continued to fight. What are we to make of this? Are the Easterlings just evil? Are we to look at these cultures from Middle-earth and just write them off as irredeemable? I'm not so sure. I don't think Tolkien would appreciate the idea that some people are just inherently evil and cannot be changed, especially if we're talking about people, not fantasy creatures like orcs. For the purposes of the story, these groups add a lot to the texture of the War of the Ring. It adds something to the dimension of the conflict that other human nations are siding with Sauron because they see more value in that than by siding with Gondor and her allies. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how Sauron's army was really a coalition of different groups, Saruman amongst them. Well, Saruman's army itself is also a coalition, primarily consisting of orcs and Uruk-hai. Saruman also created an alliance with the men of Dunland. So who are these men of Dunland? Dunlendings, as they would call themselves. Well, Are they another race of outsiders whose service to dark forces irrevocably marks them as evil? Well, no. I actually think that they have a very understandable reason for joining in with Saruman. You see, the Dunlendings are people who are descendants of the tribal hill people that lived in Middle-earth before the widespread settlement of the Númenóreans. These people lived without the higher levels of technology that the Númenóreans would have had, but they were prolific in spreading around Middle-earth. They lived across the plains of Dunland, hence the name. However, despite this, they were never necessarily a powerful people, and when the Númenóreans came to Middle-earth, the Dunlendings were very quickly eclipsed by the former. The ancestors of the Rohirrim, who were originally from the Rhovanian region of Middle-earth, would eventually come to become allies of Gondor. In the year 2509, Gondor called for aid against a large invasion of Easterlings, and Eorl the Younger came to Gondor's aid. He and his army rode south and helped Gondor win this battle, and in response, Eorl was gifted the lands of Celenardhon for his people to grow. The Gondorians realized that these people, the Rohirrim, would be a helpful bulwark against both Sauron and the Easterlings, and so gave them this land to develop. However, the land was not empty. In fact, it was the domain of the Dunlendings. They had not been consulted about this resettlement. In fact, they would be driven out of their lands by Eorl and his people, eventually founding the kingdom of Rohan in their stead. The Dunlendings were not entirely wiped out, just forced to live in less hospitable lands to the west. Conflicts frequently erupted between the Dunlendings and the Rohirrim. The people of Dunland never forgot their ancestral enmity with the Rohirrim, and it's this enmity that enabled Saruman to gain their allegiance in the War of the Ring. They hate us, and they are glad, for our doom seems certain to them. The king, they cry. We will take their king, death to the Forgoil, death to the Strawheads, death to the robbers of the north. Such names they have for us. Not in 500 years have they forgotten their grievance that the lords of Gondor gave the mark to Eorl the Young and made alliance with him. That old hatred Saruman has inflamed. Glamling, the Two Towers, Helm's Deep. So we know what happens next. The Dunlendings take up with the cause of Saruman, hoping to defeat Rohan and reclaim their lands. They will lose, and they will lose badly. In a rare show of mercy, the surviving Dunlendings from the Battle of Helm's Deep were not executed, but rather ordered to retreat behind the river Isen, swearing a vow to never again take up arms against Rohan. Even their dead were given a communal burial, as opposed to just being left to rot like the orcs. Saruman had told the Dunlendings that the Rohirrim would offer them no mercy, no quarter, and so this act of mercy broke their resolve to continue their fight against the Rohirrim. A small force would even help Gondor during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. It's not remarked in detail about what happens to Dunland after the War of the Ring. Ostensibly, during the Fourth Age, Dunland becomes a protectorate of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, but as far as we know, the people of Dunland were never actually given restitution for their displacement. The mod for Rome Total War, Fourth Age Total War, does the best job, I think, of expanding upon the lore of the future of Dunland. Despite the mercy shown to them, the people of Dunland were never actually given any proper restitution, so naturally, when the rulership of Gondor starts to fracture, they rise up again, hopefully to finally avenge themselves against the Rohirrim. Whether they succeed or lose, well, that's up to the players. What I think this conflict demonstrates is that there's a lot of complexity buried into the world of Middle-earth. A lot of people remark that Tolkien's work is very morally simple, and I would mostly agree with that sentiment. But when you zoom in to something like this, suddenly things aren't so simple. The Dunlendings are clearly victims of dispossession and violence. They're by far the weaker people between the Rohirrim and themselves. Gondor supports Rohan both materially and politically, and as the regional hegemon, it has the power to enforce its policies. Gondor could have stopped the displacement, but the displacement of the Dunlendings was their fault in the first place. Because of the decision made hundreds of years ago, a great amount of personal and human suffering was inflicted on both the people of Dunland and Rohan. It's no surprise to me that the Dunlendings go so heavy into pikes. The people they care most about defeating are famed for their use of cavalry. And yet, what else are they to do? The lands of Rohan are richer and more bountiful, and the Rohirrim largely look down upon the Dunlendings as a lesser people. One of the consistent themes about Lord of the Rings is that the pursuit of power is a dark obsession, that those who are relentless in their pursuit of power will only destroy themselves and others. And yet, what if you pursue something else than power, something like justice? I don't think Tolkien intended for the story of the Dunlendings to be one about might making right. That those who have the power to take things have the right to keep them. And yet, that is also how the story goes. The Dunlendings are never actually given any proper resolution to their grievances. The fact that they held them for so long is proof that it hurt them so deeply. At best, they simply have to retreat to the less hospitable lands and accept that Rohan will forever be more powerful than them. At worst, if Rohan expands their borders, they will be further dispossessed. Yet, I hope you agree that the solution to this problem is not for the Dunlendings to go reconquer their lands and kick out the Rohirrim. If there has been any chance for them to resist the invasion, then that was perhaps their best chance for a military resolution to this problem. But centuries later, a reconquest would just repeat the same injustice foisted upon them by the Rohirrim. In reality, the best way forward would be some kind of mutual integration of the people of Dunland and Rohan into a new single political entity. But since Tolkien never wrote much more beyond the Third Age, such a resolution is left to speculation and imagination. Still, I hope that this video has given you a bit to think about with regards to the complexities of Middle-earth. I certainly think it adds to the richness of the world, and it goes far beyond more petty things like asking about Aragorn's tax policy. I'd like to thank our patrons, Discordans, Liam Anderson, and Dorian. If you'd like to support this work, please take a look at our Patreon or YouTube memberships. We are also perfectly happy for people to just share the videos and subscribe to the channel. Give us a like, maybe comment what you think of this video. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.